Welcome to the Implementing CDBG webinar series presented by the New Hampshire Community Development Finance Authority, also known as CDFA. My name is Ed Geiger, and the topic for this module is acquisition and relocation. You can download a copy of the PowerPoint slides for this webinar from the CDFA website for your reference. Let's get started. This slide and the next provides a quick overview of this webinar and the topics we will cover. We will review both voluntary and involuntary acquisition, as well as highlight acquisition of easements and donation transactions. For relocation, we will address who is covered by displacement, the required relocation benefits, and how to address temporary relocation. In general, this webinar will provide a high-level review of the process and requirements for both acquisition and relocation. Not every technical detail will be covered in this webinar, but you will gain a good understanding of these compliance requirements for CDBG projects. URA. When federal funding such as CDBG is used in a project involving the acquisition, rehabilitation, or demolition of real property, a federal law known as the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act, also called the Uniform Act, or URA for short, may apply. The purpose of URA is to provide uniform, fair, and equitable treatment for persons whose real property is acquired or who are displaced as a result of CDBG-funded programs or activities. It is important to be aware of the URA requirements because they may arise unexpectedly and can considerably impact the economics and financial viability of a CDBG project. The Act establishes minimum standards when performing these activities, including requirements that will increase project costs when those activities displace persons from their homes, businesses, or farms. URA is administered with uniform procedures by 18 federal agencies, including HUD. The lead federal agency is transportation, specifically the Federal Highway Administration, also called FHWA. Consequently, the regulations for URA are found in the transportation portion of the Code of Federal Regulations, 49 CFR Part 24. URA requirements can have a significant impact on a project and consequently must be taken into account early in the planning process. Effective planning is key. It is essential to understand all of the steps that must be followed in acquiring property with respect to the Uniform Act. HUD imposes its additional implementing regulations at 24 CFR 570.606. Now the grantees must have a grievance procedure in place, which is discussed in the Grantee Requirements module of this webinar series. CDBG grantees must also comply with URA requirements for their projects, even if other funds, including local or private funds, are actually used for the acquisition. Section 104D of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, also known as the Barney-Frank Amendment, established additional housing-related requirements when activities have the potential of reducing the stock of lower-income housing units. This statute imposes requirements to replace lost lower-income housing stock, which includes units that rent for the Section 8 fair market rent or less. Section 104D also can provide a higher level of relocation benefits than the URA benefits allow for displaced low and moderate income persons. HUD regulations also impose requirements that a local government grantee must certify to the state that it has in effect and is following a residential anti-displacement and relocation assistance plan, and that it will minimize displacement of persons as a result of assisted activities. This plan must be discussed at a public meeting as part of the citizen participation process when developing a CDBG application. Also, HUD requires that before committing CDBG funds for any activity that will directly result in the demolition of lower-income dwelling units or the conversion of lower-income dwelling units to another use, the recipient must make public information regarding the project and process to provide replacement units. That information must then be submitted to CDFA and approved by HUD. Exceptions to the replacement requirements are possible based on objective data that demonstrate an adequate supply of vacant lower-income dwelling units existing after low-income housing units are eliminated. Any exception must be approved by CDFA and forwarded to HUD. Eminent domain is a term that figures significantly into any discussion of acquisition and relocation. Eminent domain is the government's ability to take property for public use with just compensation to the property owner, which has its basis in the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It is also called condemnation. HUD imposes restrictions on eminent domain. Use of CDBG funds for eminent domain in an economic development project is specifically prohibited. Property acquired through eminent domain with CDBG funds must be for projects that have a public benefit. These include public water and sewer infrastructure, road and transit projects, and community facilities. One of the primary concepts to take away from this webinar is an understanding of the difference between voluntary and involuntary acquisition. The Uniform Act establishes different treatment and procedures for the two different types of acquisition. The distinction between the two is not whether the purchaser has the power of eminent domain. Voluntary acquisitions are possible by local governments. It is just as important to understand that purchases made by nonprofits and private entities are not always voluntary. Transactions by such groups can be involuntary even though these purchasers do not have eminent domain power. Also, willing seller transactions are frequently confused as voluntary transactions. However, just because you have a willing seller does not mean you have a voluntary acquisition. A willing seller can be someone in either a voluntary or involuntary acquisition. Now we will review both types of transactions. Voluntary first. All voluntary transactions must meet the following three requirements. First, there must be no threat of eminent domain to be used in the acquisition. Local governments with eminent domain power must disclose upfront that they will not use such power. Once that notice is issued, the local government must adhere to that decision and cannot change it. Second, the specific site acquired must not be required for the project. Any of several properties could be acquired for the project's purposes. And third, the property to be acquired must not be part of an intended, planned, or designated project area where all or substantially all of the properties will be acquired within a specific time frame, such as a redevelopment area project. All three conditions must be met in order to pursue a voluntary acquisition. Again, it does not matter whether you have a willing seller or have eminent domain power. Grantees must meet this three-point criteria in order to acquire property voluntarily. If your purchase meets the requirements of a voluntary acquisition, here are the steps in that process. The local agency or purchaser must inform the owner in writing of the interest to acquire the property and its market value. Fair market value can be determined without an appraisal by someone with knowledge of the local real estate market. The agency must also inform the owner in writing that the property will not be acquired if negotiations do not reach an amicable agreement. If a local government or an entity acting on behalf of a local government is seeking the property, the notice must add that condemnation will not be used. Again, once made, that decision cannot be changed. You can negotiate the sale and proceed to closing as long as the price does not exceed the fair market value. Finally, it is important to remember that any displaced tenants or businesses are provided relocation assistance. However, property owners in a voluntary transaction are not eligible for relocation benefits. This slide highlights some of the advantages of the voluntary process if the transaction meets all of the requirements for a voluntary acquisition. Voluntary acquisitions have a simplified process to determine property value because an appraisal and review appraisal are not required. There are less stringent requirements on the price to be paid for the property. A local agency can negotiate an offer less than fair market value. Relocation costs can be reduced because owner-occupants are not eligible. Tenants, however, are still eligible for the relocation benefits. This and the next two slides provide a brief overview of the steps in an involuntary acquisition. Several details are not discussed as part of this overview. Those details are contained in CDFA's implementation guide. Actually, this HUD flowchart is missing a critical first step to inform the property owner. For involuntary acquisition, the first critical step is to provide the required notice to the owner. The local agency should provide to the property owner either the notice of interest or notice of intent to acquire their property. The Uniform Act then specifies a process to determine and pay just compensation to the property owner. URA requires that a qualified appraiser estimate the fair market value of the property through a formal appraisal process. You must invite the owner to accompany the appraiser when visiting the property. Then the appraisal must be reviewed by a qualified review appraiser for consistency and reasonableness and to ensure that it meets all standards. The local administrative agency procuring property must establish the amount of just compensation to offer the property owner, which cannot be less than the approved appraisal. An authorized agency employee from the entity acquiring the property must confirm the amount to be offered based on the appraisal process. Agencies then must provide a written offer to the property owner for just compensation. A verbal offer does not meet URA requirements. After making the written offer, a reasonable period of negotiation should occur where the property owner can review the offer, ask questions, accept or reject the offer, or make a counteroffer. Agencies can pay more than the amount of the established just compensation offer by using an administrative settlement, if it is reasonable, prudent, and in the public interest. CDFA will only allow CDBG funds to pay up to the fair market value established by a formal appraisal and review appraisal. Any cost above that amount must be derived from local funds or another source of funding included in the project. An example administrative settlement agreement is included in CDFA's implementation guide. If you are successful in reaching a settlement, you will go to a closing with the property owner, paying the owner's related incidental expenses in addition to the sales price, and obtain title to the property. If negotiations are unsuccessful, agencies with eminent domain authority may choose to pursue condemnation through the eminent domain process or decline the acquisition. Agencies without condemnation powers must walk away. If you plan to pursue condemnation, it is recommended you consult with CDFA staff regarding the potential increased project costs and determine CDFA's willingness to accept an increased acquisition cost due to that legal process. At any time after starting the acquisition process, if you decline to pursue the acquisition, you need to send a formal notice to the owner of that decision. Acquisition by donation or partial donation is permitted by URA. It is important to determine first whether the transaction would otherwise be considered a voluntary or involuntary acquisition, then follow the required acquisition procedures with these modifications. Provide an additional notice to the owner with a request for donation. Give an option to the owner to have fair market value set for a voluntary acquisition or just compensation established for involuntary and respond accordingly. Then complete the acquisition with either the full or partial donation. If the owner changes their mind, continue to follow the URA process for either voluntary or involuntary acquisition as applicable. Next, we want to review acquisition of easements. Easements provide rights-of-way access that may be permanent or temporary. These acquisitions are also covered by URA requirements. Like donations, easements may be acquired either in a voluntary or involuntary transaction. First, determine which of the two types of transaction is applicable. Then follow the required procedures for that type of acquisition. One exception exists for URA regarding easements. Temporary easements to exclusively benefit the property owner are not subject to the Uniform Act. Easements, both temporary and permanent, are only very rarely considered voluntary. Once a project is planned or a designated project site is selected, it is generally a site-specific acquisition requiring that involuntary acquisition procedures be used. In the next portion of this webinar, we will discuss relocation requirements. If the building you acquire for your CDBG project is occupied, you may have to make relocation payments to the owners and other occupants. Relocation is an important compliance area to consider when managing CDBG and federally funded projects. Any person or entity who is displaced as a result of federally funded activity may be entitled to relocation payments. All owner-occupied properties and tenants, without regard to income, plus businesses, nonprofits, and farms are potentially eligible for such benefits under URA. Low and moderate income occupants, less than 80% of the median income, are also covered by Section 104D, which generally offers a higher level of benefits. Two critical issues to understand for relocation requirements are the definition of displacement, which determines eligibility for relocation, and the required costs of relocation benefits. These costs are above and beyond the hard construction costs. They need to be considered upfront when planning a project. The definition of displaced person is found at 49 CFR 24.2A9. That definition states in part, a displaced person is any person who moves from the real property or moves his or her personal property from the real property, either as a direct result of a written notice of intent to acquire, the initiations of negotiations for, or the acquisition of such real property in whole or in part for a project, or as a direct result of rehabilitation or demolition for a project. A person can be an individual, family, partnership, corporation, or association. You should refer to the regulatory citation on this slide for the complete definition of displaced person. Also, the CDBG program regulations extend beyond URA to cover economic displacement. If rents are increased after a CDBG project is completed and the new rent exceeds 30% of the tenant's gross monthly income, they would be economically displaced. Persons who are not displaced under URA include those who move temporarily and can return. However, other benefits for temporary relocation may be applicable. Unlawful occupants, those evicted for cause unrelated to the project, tenants who receive a move-in notice prior to occupancy that informs them of a pending project acquisition and not being eligible for relocation benefits. Owner-occupants agreeing to a voluntary acquisition also are not eligible. Note, CDFA's implementation guide provides guidance on squatters' rights with the relocation chapter. Displacement and relocation benefits under Section 104 requires that a household occupant must qualify as low or moderate income as defined by the CDBG regs. These relocation benefits arise when the loss of lower income dwelling units due to rehabilitation, conversion, or demolition in connection with the CDBG-assisted activity. Residents displaced under Section 104D provisions must be given benefit levels and the option to choose relocation benefits under either Section 104D or URA. The benefits to pay for tenants' future rental payments are generally better under Section 104D, but greater homeownership options are provided by URA. People who are not considered displaced under Section 104D include tenants evicted for cause unrelated to the project and tenants who receive a move-in notice prior to occupancy, similar to that described for URA. This slide outlines the benefits to be provided to displaced persons, including some indication as to the potential costs associated with those benefits. Agencies must offer residential displaced persons comparable risk replacement housing before they can be required to move. This is part of the assistance included in the relocation advisory services, but it is also necessary to determine the payment of benefits. Comparable replacement housing must be decent, safe, and sanitary. URA regulations define comparable replacement housing at 49 CFR 24.2a. Moving costs can be either the actual costs incurred or follow a schedule of fixed payments established by the Federal Highway Administration. This fixed payment is generally more favorable because the household does not have to show receipts and can pocket the total fee regardless of actual costs. Replacement housing costs are based on the difference in price between the displaced unit and relocation unit. Renters are eligible for 42 months of payments based on this differential. Renters may choose to receive a lump sum payment if they want to purchase a home through the relocation process. Owners are eligible for not only the price differential of the purchase of a relocated home, but also the added legal and financial expenses at closing. There are confusing statutory limits on payments to owners of $31,000 and tenants of $7,200. However, housing of last resort requirements imposed by HUD supersede those limits. Whenever comparable replacement dwellings are not available within the URA monetary limits on replacement housing payments, the displacing agency must provide housing of last resort assistance. Paying replacement housing payments in excess of these URA statutory limits is authorized and common. Relocation advisory services are also required for non-residential entities such as businesses, nonprofits, and farms. These entities may receive payments for the actual physical moving costs and related non-residential costs, expenses such as utility connections, professional services, and impact fees. And small businesses are also eligible for up to $25,000 for reestablishment expenses. These are expenses actually incurred in reestablishing the small business, including physical improvements at the new location, cost of advertising the new location, and estimated increased cost of operation at that location. Or, as an alternative for dislocated businesses, they can receive a fixed payment in lieu of all other relocation benefits. This fixed payment option is based on the average annual net earnings and is capped at $40,000. Court costs are not a benefit, but are another cost consideration related to relocation requirements. Section 104D provides an alternative set of benefits to homeowners or renters who are low or moderate income residents, meeting the 80% LMI definition. Owners or renters receive 60 months of assistance payments toward either rental assistance or purchasing a home with certain restrictions. Benefits under Section 104D to purchase a replacement home are limited to home purchases in a mutual housing or cooperative housing arrangement. Purchasing a home that does not meet these requirements must be based on the URA benefit calculations and follow the URA process. Some projects require occupants to relocate temporarily until they can return to the project. URA regulations provide minimum requirements for temporary relocation, which should not exceed 12 months. Temporary relocation payments include reimbursement of reasonable out-of-pocket expenses related to the temporary move. If relocation will exceed 12 months, residents must be offered the option to relocate permanently. If a business will be shut down for any length of time due to rehabilitation of a site, the business may be temporarily relocated and reimbursed for all reasonable out-of-pocket expenses, or the local grantee agency may choose to permanently relocate the business according to the standard URA relocation procedures. In wrapping up this webinar, this slide offers some reminders of important tips to follow to assure compliance with acquisition and relocation requirements. If federal funds are used in any phase of a project, URA requirements apply to all acquisition of real property and relocation of occupants for the project, regardless of the source of funds used for acquisition. Provide all required notices for acquisition and relocation. Also, document receipt by getting the owners and any tenants to sign and return those required notices. Also, remember, voluntary acquisitions depend on the circumstances that involve more than a willing seller and more than the buyer not possessing eminent domain power. The 3-point criteria must be met in order to undertake a voluntary acquisition. This slide provides links to several useful resources to assist administrators in complying with federal URA and Section 104D requirements. These resources are found on the HUD and Federal Highway Administration websites. That concludes our presentation on acquisition and relocation. Should you have any questions, please contact the CDFA Program Manager using the contact information on this slide.